The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 1, The Fall. Chapter 3. Tal's second plan would have to wait for 7 days, when he could enter the next achievement of luminosity. While he waited, he tried very hard to be a model student. Whenever an idea for a practical joke came into his head, or he got bored as the assistant lecturer droned on about recursive light or spectral shifting, the soft chink of the deluminance on his wrist would remind him to behave. Even with his best efforts, it was a hard week for Tal. After every evening meal, Kusi would forget and ask for her father to put her to bed. She cried when he didn't come and was too young to understand that it wasn't because he didn't want to. Grail was too weak to get out of bed herself, so it had fallen to Tal to tuck the little girl in and tell her a story. He then had to make sure that Gref actually went to bed at all. It was all a constant reminder of his father's absence. Tal would lie awake at night, hoping that he would hear his father's footsteps outside his room and his familiar voice asking him if all was well. Unfortunately, Tal was much more likely to hear Gref's voice saying something like, "Tal, why don't I sneak over to Lalik's room and steal a sunstone?" Or, "Tal, I bet I could drop a blanket on Korak and get her bracelet off, and she wouldn't know who did it." Or Gref's most constant question, "Tal, why can't I help you get a new sunstone?" Kusi was not much better in her own way. Besides having to read her a story, most nights he had to help her get back to sleep. She'd lie in bed looking up at him with her huge blue eyes and say, "I don't want Tal. I want Mummy." To make matters worse, Shadow Master Sushin seemed to have spread the word that Tal was to be picked on. Older chosen he had never seen before tried to get in his way and blame him for the collision. Strange spirit shadows followed him so often he stopped using the smaller stairways. He even avoided the best shortcut in the castle, the Underfolk's laundry chute, a slippery slide that spiraled from the highest chambers of the Violet down to the Red, and then beneath to the Underfolk's work caverns. Tal didn't want to meet a spirit shadow in the laundry slide. Being in the slide was the closest you could get to real darkness in the castle. There were no sunstones inside. The only light came spilling in around the hatches on each of the 49 order levels. These faint lines of light were also the only way for chute riders to know where they were, so they could push their feet out and bring themselves to a stop, usually with some damage to the soles of their shoes. So, Tal kept to the main stairs and the colorless corridors, the wide passageways that were not part of the realm of any particular order. In the lectorium they were taught that all light served the Empress, that all the orders were like a family. Tal knew this was a load of shadow spit. The chosen in the lower orders were resentful of the higher ones, and the chosen of the higher orders liked putting everyone in their place. The children were the worst. If they caught Tal creeping about, they'd gang up to blind him with their sunstones, a blindness that sometimes took days to fully wear off. Tal just tried to avoid trouble. It was even more difficult because he had to look after Gref as well. His brother was in a different lectorium, and he hadn't complained to Tal about any problems. Still, Tal tried to keep an eye on him. Gref had a genius for trouble. He was very good at making it, and at avoiding responsibility for it. But even getting away with things 8 times out of 10 meant getting caught twice. Gref's genius did not serve him well when it came to being picked on. Tal wasn't so much worried about what might happen to Gref, but what his younger brother might do to take revenge. The case of the boy who had drawn a picture of Gref as a 2-headed toppet was never far from Tal's mind. Gref had saved his allowance for 7 months, then paid a much older student to create a light puppet of himself as a truly vicious toppet, which he'd managed to get into the other boy's room at night. The boy had woken up with a scream they could hear in all 7 towers. He still couldn't see a light puppet show without shaking nervously. Gref's glory hadn't lasted long. It was clear to the authorities where the light puppet had come from, with Gref's face on it. What worried Tal the most was that even after being punished, Gref said it was worth it, and he'd do it again. Luckily, he wasn't old enough to be given to luminance. All of this trouble was a constant worry for Tal, but it was nothing compared to the continuing absence of his father. If he came back, everything would be all right. With every day that passed without him, Tal's secret fear that his father might really be dead grew stronger. He had to think harder about getting a primary sunstone. If only the horrible Lalik and Korak had just given him a sunstone, he wouldn't have to try to win an achievement of luminosity. The achievements of luminosity were held every quarter month, and more technically open to everyone who wished to demonstrate their skill and artistic abilities. It was rare for someone who only had a shadow guard like Tal to participate. The achievements were divided into several categories, each held in different parts of the castle. While all achievements tested the participant's skill with a sunstone and sense of light, each category tested other specific talents and abilities as well. Tal had put his name down for the achievement of body. This achievement was essentially an obstacle course, where fitness and dexterity were as important as light control. It was held in the Hall of Mirrors, which added an extra level of difficulty. Light had to be tightly controlled there, because the slightest slip meant thousands of embarrassing reflections. Over the week, Tal practiced on the course every afternoon after he finished at the lectorium. There were 7 obstacles, each of which had to be jumped, climbed, swung across, or crawled under. The ancient obstacles were made of solid light, a magic that was now lost to the Chosen, though some thought the Empress might know the secret ways. Participants could make the obstacle change into something else by directing a beam of light from their sunstone at exactly the right spot, in exactly the right color. The secret to doing well at the achievement of body was to turn all the obstacles in front of yourself into something easy, like a gasping hole, which could be jumped across. At the same time, you had to turn your competitors' obstacles into more difficult things, like a surprising wall. Sometimes, obstacles flickered through multiple combinations, right up into the last second, as light beams shot everywhere. It was not unknown for a gasping hole to become a surprising wall in the same instant that a competitor jumped, resulting in an unpleasant collision. Tal wasn't worried so much about that. Getting knocked out by smacking his head into a surprising wall, or tripping over a sudden deep tunnel wasn't a problem. The audience would just laugh. But any disregard of the rules of light could lead to more deluminance, and Tal could not afford that. "That won't happen," he muttered after another exhausting practice. The winner of the achievement was usually advanced several levels within his or her order, or was permitted to ask for a sunstone or some other reward instead. Tal intended to be the winner. He'd always been good at trial achievements, which all the children competed in. The practices were going well. What could go wrong? On the morning of the achievements of luminosity, Tal found out exactly what could go wrong. Nervous, he went to the Hall of Mirrors a good hour early and discovered that his name was not on the list for that day's achievement of body. It wasn't on the list for next time either, or the one after that. "But I wrote it down," Tal insisted, "in the registry, a week ago." The half-bride who had the list for the achievement of body shrugged. He was a low-ranking chosen of the Red Order, better than a dimmer, but not much above an underfolk, which was why he had an actual job. Most chosen didn't do anything so menial, devoting themselves to their hobbies or interests, or in advancing themselves through achievements or the politics of the Empress's court. "You're not here," he said, holding up the huge leather-bound book. "Maybe you accidentally signed up for some other achievement." "I can't have," said Tal. His shadow guard shook its head, too. "You'll have to go to the registry and check," said the half-bride. His spirit shadow was as lackluster as he was, a 6-legged animal of some kind that slept around his ankles. Tal nodded and sped away. Behind him he heard the man snort something like "Orange, idiot!" But Tal didn't look back. He remembered exactly what he'd signed up for. He couldn't have made a mistake. Unless he'd signed up for the wrong achievement. What if he'd signed up for the achievement of combat, or the achievement of healing? He wasn't properly trained for either of those. He'd get the white ray of disgust from the audience for sure, and have his arms loaded with illuminance. He'd become an underfolk, his mother would die, and Greffenkusi would follow him down into the dark servant halls below the castle. "I must not panic," Tal told himself. He stopped running and carefully bowed and gave light to a brilliance of the violet who passed by. He still had half an hour left. "I must not panic," Tal repeated to himself. Taking deliberate, slow breaths, he walked quickly toward the registry.